Okay, welcome to part 2. So in this part of the AA Star session, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to focus on actually looking at responses. We're going to look at some really high quality responses and look at what makes them strong and what makes them excellent. So let's start with the first one. It says, even if you don't believe in religion, you should still save sex for marriage. This is an 8-mark question. Okay, and it's on relationships. It comes in the topics of relationships, looking at whether or not you should save sex for marriage even if you are non-religious. So let's start with the first view. Just want you to take time, have a look at this response. So pause the video and I just want you to read through this response. What are the strengths of this response? What are the strengths of what they've said, the religious content, their opinion? What's strong about this answer in general? And let's see if we can pick some of that out. Right, so I'd like you to pause the video now and write down some stuff. Okay, so if you're back, let's start with the initial response. So their opinion. Now, their opinion is quite strong. One thing I personally don't like about it is they've said neither agree or disagree. I would rather them give a specific point as to agree or disagree, and then maybe they said, however, I also think that. I think that would be a nicer way to write it because... Okay, so let's look at what they've written. Because although some people consider sex as a special act between people that love each other, for some people it doesn't hold that much value. That's a really important point. Not everybody sees sex in the same way. Okay, now what this person went is actually that statement's quite clear. What they went on and said is, what I mean by this is that some non-religious, and so they went on to actually explain further what they said in the initial point. I really like that. I really like the fact that they have given an opinion and it's quite specific and clear, but they've then even taken the opportunity to go more in depth and actually pick out some more detail in the explanation, picking out words like mature adults, actually differentiating between people who are mature and can make decisions for themselves, and so they don't necessarily need marriage because they're in a stable relationship. I really like that. Okay. Let's look at the Christian opinion. Again, really strong. Highlights religious teaching in the first sentence. If we look at the second one, again, highlights religious teaching. If we look in the third one, again, highlights religious teaching. And then they use a quote. And so it's actually really interesting that they've given at least 3 different religious teachings on the importance of actually saving sex for marriage. And then they support it with a quote, rather than using the quote as the explanation for the response. So really important that we learn to do that. We pick out more religious teaching and then support that religious teaching with a quote. Okay. We look at the Islamic opinion. Quite short, quite concise. The first point's quite strong, and then it finishes with a quote. And that's it. Now we know straight away that we should have more, because actually we want to hear more about what that quote means, what that quote infers, what it suggests, what it compels Muslims to do, and how it compels them to save sex for marriage. Actually, more of that should have come through in that. And the alternative, really straightforward. It's up to you to do what you want. The justification's clear, the justification's there. So if there was one part we could really improve on, it would be the Muslim response. Really just more coming through from about what the quote means and what it infers. And let's look at the conclusion. Again, supporting the initial point from the alternative, the point after the alternative, supporting the point made in the alternative. That actually it's up to people to do what they want. This response is really good. Really lots of strengths. Good religious knowledge in there. Really high quality detail given in the explanation. That's a massive strength of this response. Absolutely massive strength of this response. The detail and the quality given in that answer is absolutely superb. And even though the Islamic point is short, the point they're given is good. Can be better by a mile. The structure, really clear, really strong. The way they've written it, the justifications, the quotes, are absolutely perfect. It fits in really well with our criteria and what we say it should look like. So let's move on to another question. Okay, so humans are the best of God's creation. This time I would like you to take your time out to respond to this question. Remember what we saw in the previous question about the quality of the response before a quote was used. And then remember what we saw in the previous answer about the quality of the initial opinion and then the quality of the alternative opinion. Really clear points, really strong justifications, and the conclusions matched what was said at the start of that point. So, are humans the best of God's creation? Do you agree with the statement that humans are the best of God's creation? I want to know your opinion in detail, in depth, justifying why you think what you think. I want to know a Christian and Muslim opinion, again, supported by religious teaching, using religious references and a quote. And then I want an alternative answer, which would probably come from, well, I'm not going to tell you, but it would probably come from someone who's not necessarily religious. And again, you can be specific. Do you want to select an animal activist's response? Do you just want to highlight that actually some people would disagree with this, and these people might, I'm not going to give you the structure, but that's what I want you to think about. I want you to think about who would disagree with that answer and what would they specifically say. So take 7 minutes, write the question, and then you use your last minute to read over the question. And go. Okay, so if you're back, it means you've written the answer, you've written the response. Please bring it to me, please bring it to your teacher. Let's have a look at it. Let's give you a mark. Okay, now let's transform the 6 mark to an 8 mark. The best way to respond to God is in a group. So if we imagine the question is a 6 mark and it says, explain from 2 religious traditions the teaching of how to respond to God. If we look at this response, it's a really, really quality, really strong response. Talks about how worshipping God in private through prayer is a good way to respond to God. It then talks about the religious teaching and what that infers and what that tells us about how people should respond to God. Okay, it continues to expand. It just doesn't give one opinion, it gives several different teachings about how people should respond to God, obeying His commandments, living right, praying privately. Really, really strong response on responding to God from a religious tradition. Again, if we look at the Islamic response, it talks about the pillars of Islam. It talks about being done together. It talks about Hajj, which is one of the pillars again. It talks about prayer. But this one focuses more on actually the things that is done on a Hajj and why this is a good way to respond to God in terms of it's in a group and why a Muslim would agree with that, and all the justifications for why a Muslim would agree with that response. Now think about, if we were turning this into an 8 mark, what would we need to add? And if you can see the quality here in the religious responses, we want exactly the same quality in your opinion and an alternative opinion. The exact same quality of response, which is a response to the question and then further justification to support the initial response given. Okay, so I want you to take about 1, 2, 3, 4 minutes, and I want you to transform that into an 8. I'm looking for the initial your view and the alternative view to support that. Once again, bring it to myself, your teacher, and we'll go through it with you. So please take 4 minutes, respond to that question now. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. This question says religious experiences are not real. Again, we're going to do what we did. We're going to analyze this question. We're going to see if it's what's strong about it and what's weak about it. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is pause the video now and have a look at this response. Okay, if you're back, so it means you've read the response, you've gone through it, and you are going to tell me whether you think this answer is good. So we'll start with the initial opinion, good or bad. It's good. All right, really strong opinion. Opinions given. Again, I don't like the agree nor disagree. I would rather you give an assertive view and then you can add however. I also disagree with this. Okay, it talks about the subjectiveness of a religious experience, how there's not a standard to measure. This answer is not necessarily you haven't been taught that in class, but you have to think about whether religious experiences are not real. And you have to think about both sides of the argument, not just one side of the argument. What would some people say, or why would some people say yes, they are real? And actually, why would some other people say no, they're not real? And you must be able to weigh up both responses, because that's going to be your opinion and the alternative opinion. Now, we straight away know that religious people are going to disagree with this question, because they believe religious experiences are real. Why? They're religious. Part of being religious is to experience God. However, let's look at the alternative. Really, really strong alternative opinion. And at the end there, in their conclusion, they've gone back to assert how they're still unsure about where they stand on this. Now, one thing I will say to you, I want you to give an assertive response, whether you agree or disagree. Even if you're not sure, pick a side, choose the side, use the other in your alternative. Or even include that alternative response in your initial answer, showing that actually there's both sides that you cling to, and you're not fully secure in your own understanding of whether you agree or disagree fully with that question. But you want to give an assertive opinion, and then you want to highlight your possible alternative view in that opinion. Okay, all right, fantastic structure again. They follow the criteria really well. Evidence is used, so it's supported really well. The quotes that are used are related back to the question. Really, really interesting, because the quotes don't seem to sort of tell us explicitly whether religious experiences are real, but they infer that, they suggest that they help to support the point of religious people believing, worshipping together and feeling that experience of God. And the quote is from the Bible that supports the idea that wherever religious people are, God is going to be there with them, and that's how they've used that quote. It's really important to note here that sometimes you might use quotes that don't seem really specific for that question, but how you tie it into the question is then important. You cannot loosely tie a quote to a detailed explanation. You must really, really ensure that quote is really, really tied well and ties in with the focus of what the response is about. So if the response says yes, then whichever quote you use has to support the idea of yes. If your response is no, then whatever quote you use has to support with the response of no. But the quote must tie in really well with that response. Okay, let's look at another. So back to this question about injustice. Fighting injustice is pointless. The essay here means South Africa. I want you to pause the video. I want you to have a look at the response. Tell me what you think about it. Strengths and weaknesses. Pause the video now. Okay, so if you're back, it means you've paused the video and you've had a look at this response. Let's start with the initial view. Nice, really good view. Would I want a bit more? I would probably, but actually I think that's fine. That secures. They've given their opinion. They've highlighted how fighting injustice is not pointless, and they've used an example of Desmond Tutu in that explanation of why it's not pointless. They've highlighted a Christian's view, but if we look here carefully, there is not much depth in this Christian view. There's a good explanation, the quote is used correctly, it's linked to the question well, but the detail that comes before that quote is not in as much detail as I would prefer and as I would like. Because remember, whenever we answer these questions, we're always going for overkill. Okay, so we look at the Islamic response, again the same thing. The response is good, the quote is good, and the explanation of what the quote compels Muslims to do is good, but we want more religious teaching, more religious depth about injustice and why it's a good thing and why it's helpful, and therefore injustice and fighting injustice cannot be pointless for a Muslim. Actually, more of that should be coming through. I think in these answers, although they're strong, the religious references, the religious quotes come in way too early before more detail or more depth is given into that response as to why a Christian or why a Muslim would disagree with that statement. Okay, now interesting, let's look at this. An atheist may argue that sometimes fighting injustice is pointless, as so many people are hurt in the struggle to bring about justice and fairness, and justice still doesn't prevail. And again, they've gone back to South Africa, and they've used Desmond Tutu, that although what he did was fantastic and it helped to fight injustice, actually the country is still not fully healed. The pains, the injustice is still not fully sorted out. And so actually someone would argue that it is a pointless thing to do. Now they've said an atheist might argue, and I don't know if that opinion solely belongs to an atheist. I think that response would have been much better saying, however, an alternative view would have been. Because you cannot assert that all atheists, because when you say an atheist, you're speaking generally. If you said some, then you would be referring to a specific amount. But I think in that response, I don't think just an atheist would hold that opinion. I think lots of people, religious and non-religious people, might hold that opinion, depending on what stance they are and how religious they are. If you have a liberal Christian, they might. If you have someone that's religious but not practicing in terms of understanding religious teaching, then they might think actually to a certain extent it's pointless. But I think actually to make that answer better, an alternative response would have been better for that. Okay, back to this question, does equality matter? I want to have a look at the answer. And I would like you to finish this, okay? So have a look at this response. Finish this response. What we're missing here is the Islamic and the alternative view. So pause the video, have a look at what's been written already. Is there anything you want to add to that initial view, or do you think that's well written? And let's do the Islamic and let's do the alternative opinion. So pause the video now. Again, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to bring this back to me so I can assess it with you. Last question, or one of the last few questions we're looking at, religious people can't believe in science and evolution. Again, I want you to have a look at this response. And then I want you to pause this video, tell me what you would do to improve this response. So pause the video now. Okay, so we're back and we're looking at the quality of this response. Again, initial view is quite strong. It's very assertive. It makes a point. It tells you what they think in terms of the question. Do they think, yes, religious people can't believe in science and evolution? They tell us about most Christians. I think what would have been better there is actually specifying a lot more clearly which specific Christians you're talking about. I think that's actually really, really important. So we've got the reference here from God made man, but again I think more detail coming through would have been better before that quote was used. And then I think actually the conclusion of that Christian opinion, linking it better to the question, would have been a lot stronger. Actually, I think we're missing a lot more detail in there. Okay, so again, if we look at the Islamic opinion, really interesting. A Muslim would share the same opinion. I'm assuming it as a Christian, that human beings were made and they didn't evolve. But then they go, however, in relation to animals and non-human creatures, a Muslim might agree with the idea of evolution. Interesting. But there's no quote there to support that. Again, I would want more religious teaching to tell me why they would agree with that, where that understanding has come from. Is it supported by the Quran? I think that's what's missing from that response there. And again, it's gone with most scientists who regard evolution would disagree, because they believe that humans evolved from a single organism. They disagree with the idea of creation as there's no proof, and they believe they have evidence to support this theory. It's interesting, that response, because although it's a good response, the question does say religious people can't believe in science and evolution. And it says most scientists who regard evolution would agree that religious people can't believe in science and evolution. Actually, they probably would. They would argue that actually some scientists would argue that evolution and science aren't separate. They can go hand in hand. So I think actually I would have preferred that response, and I would have preferred them to actually improve that. So actually we can rewrite that entire alternative opinion, because I think it's not as strong and secure as it could be. Because I think there it tells me there's something about the subject knowledge that's not quite there yet. So if you actually gave that a strong mark, then actually again look at the question and look at what it's asking. And that's an area where we can definitely improve. Alright, so here's some questions for you to practice before your exams. Practice, 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 because practice makes perfect. Any questions that you complete and you want myself or your teacher to respond to or to answer, please make sure you bring it to us, and I'll make sure it's marked and you get some feedback. I hope you found this useful, practice, practice, practice. Let me know how you're getting along. If you want me to mark anything, please bring it to me. Thank you very much.